So this is the main table surface of the saw. So it's two pieces of cast iron here and the main fence, also known as a rip fence. The rip fence runs on this bar down here, and when you're moving it, you need to unlock it, move it, lock it down again. Because of the design of this, it has a bit of play in it. So if we line this up to the mitre, you can see that you can make that quite not square. So right down here, it's maybe 1 mil off. Up there, it's about 3 or 4 mil off. What happens is when you lock it in place, it's going to straighten up, but it may not straighten up where you want it to be. So a lot of the time, what I do is I half lock it, and then I just give it a little tap to put it right in line within about 1 millimeter of where I want it. Another thing you can do is partially lock it just very lightly and use the fine adjuster by pushing it in and then twisting it, and it will move the saw along the fence as well. But I like to just use the tap method, it's more efficient. One of the things that's really important to do with all your setups on the saw is to make sure that you've got a safety zone. So a safety zone is somewhere for your material to warp into once it's been cut, if it's a piece of natural lumber, or if you're just making general cuts, you need somewhere for the offcut to go. So if you're cutting anything with a saw at any time, you need to have some way of the material moving away from the blade. So what tends to happen is that if you have the fence up against the saw the entire way, it doesn't work very well, because once the cut's made, which is somewhere around this area here, there's nowhere for the material to go. It sits between the blade and the fence, and it vibrates, and maybe it'll climb up over the blade and get thrown, or at the very least, you won't get a very clean cut out of it. So what the best thing to do is you do an offset on the fence. So this here is our fence offset. So what we do is you can mount it either way, depending on what your material is, but we just use these bolts, and depending on how high your blade is, we say to the first gullet that you can see over the table surface, and then we just tighten that up. Now, if we make the same sort of depth of cut, a couple of inches, you can see that past where the cut has been made, there is extra space for the material to go. And that's really, really important. If you're doing setups for cross-cutting using the slide or a sled or something like that, maybe you'll even set this up way back here, nowhere near the blade, so you've got to stop to put your material against, and then you've got plenty of room for your offcuts to go. So the rule of 10 is that if you're within 10 centimeters of the blade, we want you to use a push device so that your hands aren't too close. And if any part of the saw is within 10 centimeters of the blade, so typically this offset, we want you to use the sacrificial fence if it's close. And that's just to protect the machine and give us a bit longer life, because in our previous saws, we've definitely had people cut into fences and whatever else, and that's really quite frustrating because these parts are quite difficult to replace. A sacrificial fence is any piece of lumber. We've got one here, conveniently provided, and you can generally find this one floating around the shop. And what we're going to do is we're going to put it up against here, and we just get a clamp and just clamp it to the fence. And that means that you can go right up close and everything's good, the saw is protected, you're protected, everything's good. So remember, rule of 10, if you're within 10 centimeters of the blade, you need to be using a push device. If anything, part of the saw is within 10 centimeters of the blade, you need to be using a sacrificial fence or some kind of protection like that.